Well, hi everyone. It's nice to be with all of you. So I'm Courtney Gallagher. I have a really long title because my departments have long names, so I stuck it up there. So I'm a jointly appointed faculty member in the Department of, well, the newly merged Department of Emerging Geology and Geography. So it will now be the Department of Earth, Atmosphere, and the Environment. I spend the other half of my faculty time here in the Center for the Study of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, where I teach about social justice and gender inequality and race and so forth. And then as of July 1st, I'm adding a new hat, which is Campus Sustainability Coordinator. So I have, actually before I launch into that, so my background is circuitous. So my undergrad and master's degree are actually in crop and soil science. So I have like an agronomy background. I also have a French degree, which led me to spend a bunch of time in West Africa as an undergrad. And so I spent a year living in Senegal, working on agricultural projects over there, but I got really interested in sort of how people interacted with their environment. And so by the time I got to my master's and then PhD programs, I realized I was actually not wildly interested in weighing soil samples in the lab and doing soil chemistry, which is what my master's degree was in. I was more interested in people and sort of how people manage their environments and how people think about and are influenced by the political systems and the cultural systems and the social structures that they're in. So all of my research is broadly under the umbrella of environmental management. I'm trained as a political ecologist, which is just a cultural, or it's just like a geographic theory, anthropological theory that teaches you how to think about people in the context of these different social and political systems, and to think about how the global influences the local and the local spans back up to the global. So before I launch into what we are going to be doing down in Mexico, I thought I would give you a little tour of some of the different types of research I've done, because it influences broadly the way that I think about it. So as I mentioned, I've spent some time working in Africa. I spent time in Malawi. Does anyone know where Malawi is? Listen, it's your M countries.
Yes, I only work in M countries: Mexico, Myanmar, America,
Madagascar. Maybe.
Madagascar. Yeah.
So Malawi's in southern Africa. It's this little sliver of a country. It's very sleepy, like nothing happens there, so lots of people don't know where it is. I, as a master's student, worked on a bean breeding and soil management project there. I spent my PhD working, I was supposed to spend my PhD working in this coastal forest system on the coast of Kenya. You could literally snorkel every day. It was going to be amazing. Project fell apart, so instead I worked in the largest slum in sub-Saharan Africa. So there's about 500,000 people crammed into like 1.5 square miles. And so it's just, everybody's on top of each other. There's no land tenure. People familiar with that idea of land tenure? Land tenure is who owns and controls the property that you're on. So Shibo is talking about the idea of informal settlements. That means people have ended up constructing homes, living in an area where they don't actually have any legal rights to be there. And so what that means is the government often doesn't provide you any services. So there might not be any water sanitation services. There might not be road services. There might not be fire, services. And so people end up becoming very disenfranchised. And so when there are social and environmental problems, they then lack the political capital, the political will to be able to get the government to listen to them. So although there are 500,000 people living in the Kibera slums of Kenya in East Africa, the government officially recognizes 0 of them as being there. And so there's all sorts of environmental problems that go there. And so I was, they actually grow food in the slums in these vertical sacks. And so I was looking at urban agriculture and food security in terms of both environmental contamination and sort of livelihood strategies and how they were addressing food insecurity in sort of this broader milieu of But I also work here in the Midwest, and so I've had students help me with projects on farmer adoption of cover cropping, which is largely influenced by their sort of risk perception about whether or not it's worth it. I do a lot of work with community gardening in DeKalb County. We are in DeKalb County now. And then food insecurity amongst college students, which is, you all being college students probably recognize is actually a problem. Like, college is expensive, lots of students don't have equitable access to food because it's hard to work and so forth. So that's one thing. I also, because of my appointment in the Gender Studies program, work on research related to promoting the more equitable representation of women and minorities in STEM. And so a lot of that is through teaching, but I also have done some research on sort of push-pull factors, so how do we get more women into STEM, and how do we, what are some ways they've kept people are prevented from sort of moving up that pipeline. So this was at that March for Science. I think there were March for Sciences around the country, but in 2017, Chicago had a big March for Science, and there were about 60,000 people that went, and that's my daughter strapped to my chest. And so, and then this is I teach a women in science class, and this is a quilt that my students and I made in collaboration with the Anthropology Museum that had a quilts and social justice exhibit. And so they made a quilt about women in science. Okay, but I'm going to talk mostly about environmental management. So I am interested in how people perceive their environments and how that informs the way that we manage the environment. Because as Shiva said, you can make all the laws and regulations you want, but if people perceive reality to be differently, their behavior will not change, right? And so I think that you could probably all come up with examples where people's perceptions of reality have strongly influenced their behavior. Any ideas?
The last year, COVID.
Right, the last year of COVID. So the way in which people perceived the severity of COVID as a virus, or perhaps even the existence of COVID, strongly influenced the ways in which they moved through public spaces and chose to protect others and so forth. Vaccines are a whole other conversations around that. And so we see that over and over and over. So if people don't think that recycling is a thing that can be helpful to the environment, they're not going to recycle. They'll in-laws go out of their way to take recycling out of recycling bins and put it into trash bins. So there's all sorts of things. We could come up with lots of examples. I'm also interested in how we think about equity and justice in approaches to environmental management, because the US in particular, but around the world, there's a very long history of unequal treatment of people in terms of how we think about the environment. So have any of you heard the term environmental racism before? So environmental racism is, for those that may not, is the idea that we have in the US in particular chosen to deal with a lot of our toxic waste systems by putting them in areas where people of color live. And so this terminology really started to be recognized when there were actual studies showing the environmental toxic effects of, dumping our waste in predominantly Black areas mostly. But it has sort of spawned a movement, the environmental justice movement, that recognizes inequities in the way that we deal with the environment globally. And so it, of course, involves a lot of people of color, indigenous movements, and so forth. So in that vein, I've had a lot of different research projects. So I worked with a student that was interested in natural hazards, specifically volcanic hazards and risk perception in the Republic of Dominica, which is not the Dominican Republic, it's a little island in the Caribbean. And she was interested in how people's perception of volcanic risk influenced the way in which they planned to respond to the eventual eruption of one of the 9 volcanoes on the island. And the inequities in terms of how people were validating their knowledge, so indigenous knowledge systems, and the ways in which people were being involved in decision-making processes. I also had a student at this really interesting project looking at risk perception and spatial navigation in relation to gender-based violence. So for people who had experienced gender-based violence, it literally seems to be altering their mental mapping status so that they move through space. We put little trackers on them. They move through space like differently in terms of their everyday lives. And then, of course, water management. So this is the RU around water. So in 2019, I got to be part of the RU grant then, and we looked at water management and the impacts of tourism in Mexico. And so the 2019 students, which was Emily and another student named Carlise, looked at 2 big topics. The first was the impact of seaweed. So Sheba showed you those pictures of seaweed, and I'll show you some more on declining beach tourism in inland water management and tourist cenotes. And then we also looked at sunscreen. So do wear sunscreen, like Sheba said, but now I'm about to burst your bubble as to why you probably shouldn't wear sunscreen. But before I talk about that, I just want to say the social and environmental impacts of tourism industries are complex and huge. So how many of you have spent time in an area of the country or the world that you would consider to be highly touristy? Some of you perhaps live there. Okay, where have you hung out that's pretty touristy?
Where we're going.
Where we're going. Super touristy. What are maybe some of the social and environmental impacts of the tourism industry that you observed in that region?
I guess like when we went over there, I stayed more like in the local side. So
Sure.
every time we drove through like the hotel area, and so it's like really like disregard to the I guess the economy or the sustainability. And I guess like also like people are pushed away, so it's more like gentrification.
Yeah.
So,
Is that a term other people know, gentrification? Gentrification is the idea that as dollars of any kind, so you upgrade a neighborhood, tourism industries move in, whatever, the local individuals that were living there kind of get priced out and pushed out. And so we see this happening all over the country, right? And all over the world. Okay, what's another tourist area someone's hung out in, or maybe lived in?
I can say San Juan,
Okay.
Puerto Rico.
Okay.
It's a really frequented place to go on vacation, especially in the summer, all year round, really.
Okay.
And yeah, they don't see the place the same way as we locals do. You can see probably trash thrown around,
Mhm.
and they say, it's not my problem. Someone else will clean it. And you can really see the difference of mentality
Mm-hmm.
when you go there. And yeah.
Yeah, and so that's another excellent point. You know, tourists, as they visit, they're coming in for a very short amount of time and frankly often behave very badly, particularly depending on their nationality. And so environmental impacts, so we call those externalities, become other people's problems. They become the problems of the local people. Okay, any other ideas about social or environmental impacts from tourism based on some experience that you might have had?
Constructions too close to the ocean
Yeah.
and causing erosion.
Yeah. So construction getting places that really should not be put just because it is lucrative, right? It brings in a lot of money. So there's a lot of different ways that we can think about this. And so water is just one lens through which you can look at these social and environmental impacts of tourism, but it's complex, right? And it's one of those things that, like many environmental issues and social issues, is wrapped up in capitalism, hardcore wrapped up in capitalism. And so getting it to change has to also be profitable, or there have to just be laws. And that's frankly how a lot of things have changed in the United States in terms of the environment, is we just regulated it. We just made a law and now it's illegal to do that, and now you can't do that. Well, people do, but then they get sued. So how do we think about incentivizing good water management practices in the tourism industry and around tourism based in communities? And then I just want to point out that tourism industry includes far more than just the hotels and the tourists, right? And so we started to talk about this with the idea of growth and gentrification. So regional growth is driven by the tourism industry. The Riviera Maya, Quintana Roo area in particular, because there's very few people that, like, several generations back live there. Most people are migrants from either other parts of Mexico or other Central American regions. Hotels can make environmentally responsible choices if you look at just the hotel, but it's embedded in this political and economic system that is often just very much driven by how do we get more tourists there, how do we get more jobs, and so forth. So a lot of my work, as I said, revolves around sort of this idea of risk perception, and there's lots of different things, as we've seen. Exhibit A this year in the United States can influence risk perception. So there's really good literature documenting how people's age can influence risk perception, their gender, their class, their race. It's hard to say because it changes by issue, but in general, the older people are, the more risk averse they are. Although interestingly this year, the more they seem to just disregard risk entirely. People who identify as women tend to be slightly more risk averse, especially around issues that impact like day-to-day livelihood events. Class and race, it often just depends on kind of people's lived experience. But level of education, the more people understand an issue, often the more risk averse they can be. occupation, growth orientation, and past experience. And what I would just say is that perceived risk is not always grounded in reality, but it does dictate the way that people are going to act. So I'm going to walk you through 2 prior research projects, one of which Emily ended up being on a publication out of, because it sort of demonstrates the way that we think about these issues, and then I'll talk about what we have planned for this year. So as Sheba mentioned, there has been a seaweed invasion on this part of the coast of Mexico. The reason why there is a seaweed invasion is complex. It has a lot to do with nutrient pollution off the coast of South America, and then climate change changing water circulation patterns. And so as a result, they're getting these massive, not algae blooms, but blooms of seaweed in the ocean, and then ocean currents are carrying them to the coast of Mexico, and it's washing up on the beaches. And this is a problem, particularly if you're in a touristy area, because no one wants to swim on the beach if there's seaweed there. And it does release these noxious gases. It is really foul to smell when you're around it. I've seen reports of people getting, mild burns or skin irritation from swimming near it, or particularly the workers cleaning it up. And so one of the things we were interested in is how is that changing tourist behaviors, and then what they view as acceptable to do. So you start with this massive seaweed problem on the beaches. Tourists, but also the tourism industry intentionally was like, hey, we have these other water sources, we should move inland to cenotes. So people will go swimming in these cenotes. You are literally, as you've heard, bathing in the groundwater. And so now there's all of these issues with pollution. And Mel, if you haven't, I'm sure you will talk to them about all of the things you can find in cenote water. And so there's a concern that you could have a decrease in water quality, but more concerning to us, and what was part of the research, was we went through and we did what's called a document analysis. So you pull all of the policies and laws that are relevant to the regulation of cenotes in terms of the environment. And we looked at the 3 different states in the Yucatan and looked at, do they regulate cenotes at all? And the short story is no, not really. So there's some limited regulation, but very little in terms of tourist capacity. So if you think about it, like, if one person went swimming in a cenote and all their sunscreen and bug spray washed off, it would probably not cause a huge problem. But if you have 200 people swimming daily in a cenote, then you start to hit that carrying capacity, right? Where the compounds are not able to break down. And at this moment, there's almost no regulation of this. And so if you really want to start to think about how do you deal with the seaweed problem, how do you think about sustainable tourism, you really need to start to think about how are these things all interconnected in terms of environmental management, and how do we improve policies and regulations. We're not saying don't send the tourists to cenotes, we're just saying there needs to be some regulation of this so that we can make sure we're not going to then ruin these fresh bodies of waters for tourism, but also for people to drink them, because it's part of the local residents' drinking water. And so this, you can see, if this pattern played out year after year after year, could set up a massive environmental injustice problem, right? Because the people that live in and around these cenotes are not drinking this water that all these tourists are drinking in. This is where I disappoint you all about sunscreen. So the other part of our project is we were interested in how people understand the impacts of sunscreens. So sunscreens can have a really negative impact, particularly if they wash off into water systems that are dependent on sunlight, so like coral reefs. So sunscreens are literally meant to block the sun out, right? So as they start to land on the microorganisms in the coral reef, they will cause them to die off. Coral is a symbiotic association between this photosynthetic algae and, I've forgotten the name of the little creature, but it's what builds the calcification. And so it'll cause what's called bleaching. So I'm not sure if any of you have ever been able to snorkel around a coral reef before, but you will often come across patches that are totally bleached like this. It's not caused only by sunscreen. Sunscreen is a common contributor to it, but ocean pollution of many kinds can impact the health of corals and cause bleaching. So one of the other major risks to coral reefs right now is climate change, because as oceans warm up and acidify, it's sort of bumping these little coral polyps out of their temperature range that they're accustomed to and the pH range that they're accustomed to, and they're bleaching. But sunscreen can be a problem. and lots of sunscreens can be a problem. So states like Hawaii have actually banned the use of sunscreens when swimming, except for the like reef-safe sunscreens that they have approved. And in Mexico as well, certain areas will not tell you you're not supposed to wear sunscreen or that you need to use certain types of safe sunscreen, but it's less well enforced. There's a lot of confusion around labeling. Like, is natural okay? Does it need to say biodegradable? Does it need to say reef safe? Does it need to say organic? You know, these all have different meanings that are very confusing to tourists. And so we partnered with a collaborator at CC who's a social scientist, but also what would you say Jesus' training is? He's a biochemist? Anyway.
Biochemist.
And so he had done this prior study looking at just like how reef safe really are different types of reef safe sunscreens, and found that even those could have really detrimental impacts on. So we needed the social science data to complement his data, which is how often, how much sunscreen do tourists apply? Like, are they aware of these regulations? Are they putting it on once a day? Are they putting it on 5 times a day? Are they putting a tablespoon on, or are they slathering half a cup all over their body? To what extent do they understand potential contamination issues around sunscreen? And then how does their general level of environmental concern correlate with and influence their behaviors around sunscreen? Do you remember that one cenote we were at? I don't know if you overheard this conversation. I was so pissed. At the cenotes, you're not supposed to wear sunscreen, and if you do have it on, they tell you to go wash it off, which is fruitless effort because it just then runs into the cenote. But, but I heard these Americans, of course, getting off the tourist bus to get there, and they're like, I just put it on the bus so no one would see me. And I was like, you jerks, it's now going into the water. And so people may understand the risk, they may understand the rules, but it's still like not changing their behavior. So we were trying to quantify and understand sort of how people were thinking about this. So that publication's off in review right now.
We just got an email about it.
Actually, accepted with revisions.
Is that what that
Yeah.
email was? I just saw an email, so.
Yeah, accepted with revisions, which is a good place to be. So to collect this data, we use a lot of methods because I like to complicate life, apparently. So we use what's called a mixed methods research approach, where you're combining quantitative and qualitative data. So most of the quantitative data is survey data that you're collecting. So 2 years ago, the project was surveys of tourists and local residents. And so you can see Emily there with their other student Kylie's with iPads, talking to people, asking questions. We also did key informant interviews in the last project. We'll do that again in this project. And so key informant just means you're interviewing not just a random person, but somebody who's a topical expert, right? So in this case, we were talking to, did he lead snorkeling expeditions, right? And so we were talking about his knowledge of like people putting sunscreen on snorkeling expeditions and kind of what changes he's seen around the reef. It's really a hardship. We had to spend a lot of time hanging out near the beach. It was actually a hardship staring at the beach and not getting to go swimming. And this is our collaborator Diego that we'll be working with again when we go down.
Can I ask a question?
Of course, please.
So what kind of groups of people did you get, not better results, but like more prone to answering these questions?
What do you think, Emily? People, yeah, maybe. I think that was partly also just there weren't as many tourists there at that time compared to, yeah. So yeah, maybe more local residents, but like, or national, like Mexican nationals who had traveled to that area to go on vacation. But it's really hit or miss. Like, for every survey you get answered, you've probably stopped 4 or 5 other people to ask them to answer your survey. And I expect it to be worse with COVID, right? So we have some strategies we're going to try to get people to want to talk to us, but we'll see. This year we're also planning to disseminate the survey partially online because topically it will work for what we're working on. And so then again, also we did document analysis of policies and laws and textual analysis of newspapers, particularly looking at like, was this a government strategy to push people from the seaweed covered beaches inland? And it was. So this year we're turning slightly, still in the vein of environmental management and water management. But there's this thing that's being built called the Maya train that is going to be a tourist and local train, allegedly, that is going to move the entire Yucatan Peninsula. And so they have already started construction in Puerto Morelos, and it will run down the entire coast. It's going not quite up to Cancun, but starting at the airport. You said that has to do with the taxi union, right? They didn't want it going into
Yeah, the
city?
taxi union doesn't want it into Cancun because they want to still be able to control the transport of the tourists. And so they're still upset that it's still going to take care of like the whole Riviera Maya.
Right.
But
All of this is political. If anybody ever tells you that an issue is not political, they are lying. So it'll go all the way around, it'll go inland, it'll go all the way down to the border of Belize.
And the sad thing is it's not stopping in like any of the Maya controlled areas of Quintana Roo and Campeche. So the places where it's, well, you know, their first language is Maya, they're not even stopping there. They just run right past them. So we can talk about social justice just even from like not being able to.
Oh, I mean, that was not an accident, right?
Yeah, no, it's not an accident, yeah, they just don't want, yeah.
Right, they are going through areas in ways that can cause environmental destruction and disrupt, you know, human settlements, but, so there had actually been lawsuits, like numerous lawsuits against this project where they halted construction of the project because it was going through, you know, an area that had important archaeological significance, or human settlement significance. It's likely that this will continue. Are any of you familiar in the United States with the EPA's environmental impact statement process, the EIS? So in the US, in theory, most of the time, if there's a federal construction project, a state construction project, prior to being able to do that, you have to do what's called an environmental impact statement, and you assess what is the risk to the environment, to local people around there from doing this. They have a comparable process down in Mexico that, according to conversations with local collaborators, just kind of happened. And so corruption can contribute to getting around these things. And so because they don't have these formal environmental processes to make sure that it's being done in an environmentally and socially sound way, the potential impacts of this type of project can be huge, on top of what would a rapid increase in tourism do. So the town of Puerto Morelos, where we're going to be working, is tiny. It's like 15,000 residents, and they are one of the first stops. And so you can picture a scenario in which suddenly it's very easy to get there and there's an explosion in tourism. And so how well do local officials and local residents currently perceive and understand this risk? Because that will influence the way that they then carry out planning and management around this risk, including water, because they obviously are next to a beach. So we can look at other transportation projects around the world, because this is obviously not the first major train project ever built. And we know that it often leads to more jobs in tourism, which then leads to greater migration to the region. So it can have some economic benefits, right? Like this can be a good thing. But anytime you grow a place too quickly, too rapidly, and you don't have the capacity in the government and planning sector, what rapid urban growth leads to is unplanned settlements. So settlements that happen without properly connecting the electrical lines, the water pipes, the solid waste management systems, and it is quite plausible something like this could play out in many places of the Riviera Maya. You also, as we talked about, get rapid gentrification in touristy areas, so areas that were once considered to be more local become they become super strip mall-y, and then people get pushed out. You will definitely see, I say definitely just because I have yet to see anywhere else in the world where it has played out differently. You will see an increase in income inequality regionally, and there's even concerns about this with the train itself because it's expensive to ride, at least based on how they're pricing it out. So this is very clearly going to be a train for tourists.
For the locals.
Well, obviously, locals are allowed to ride it, and that's what they keep saying, but if local people can't afford it, then it's not for the locals. And so there's conversations already happening, is this a train for tourists or is this a train for locals? And our colleagues down there seem to very clearly think this is not a train for locals, or at least not sort of average local residents. And then, of course, environmental regulations are often poorly enforced everywhere in the world, but particularly around this project. So I mentioned that there have been numerous lawsuits around this, and probably will continue to be, but it's considered one of these mega projects that the national government is implementing. So it seems to be by hell or high water they are going to get this thing constructed, and we'll see what happens. So this summer, we're really interested in broadly looking at sort of the social and environmental impacts in terms of how are people perceiving this, and what is the potential capacity of a small town like Puerto Morelos to absorb an increase in tourism in terms, particularly in terms of their water sanitation systems, their solid waste management systems, and so forth. So those of you that will be working with us, we're going to be surveying local residents, both in person and online, because there have been a number of community groups that have formed on Facebook and so forth, where they have, because it's a pandemic, so they couldn't be in person, where people are having lots of conversations, and so we have an opportunity to disseminate there. We're going to be doing interviews with residents and also key informant interviews. Key informant interviews would be people that work with things like the municipal solid waste management program, the water treatment plant, and so forth. Content analysis. So as I said, there's been active social media presence around this issue, and so we get to go back through a year of Facebook posts. And you clip them and then use something called OCR object content recognition, and it pulls the text out of it, and then you can do content analysis on the text. Newspaper articles, and then document analysis, looking at policy documents and technical documents. We may or may not get through all of this, but it's good to be optimistic. Oh, that's it. That's as far as I got making this presentation. So happy to answer questions if anyone has any.
No, I have a question about the sunscreen. You said that in Hawaii, they made it illegal to use sunscreen unless they're using the one that they approved for this.
Correct.
Now, how do they track that compared to how it's tracked, let's say, in Cancun?
They literally have people on beaches walking up and down. I've heard of people like starting to put on sunscreen and someone like swoops in and finds them and takes their sunscreen away.
Okay.
That's not happening there.
They take out a little bottle of sunscreen.
Yeah. So, and I don't know if you've had any experience like entering any of the like Rio Secreto or any of those.
Yeah, so what they'll do is they'll have you wash, so they'll walk you up to a shower, and they'll watch you do it, but then, you know, once you're sitting down, no one's really paying attention.
And Diego and Jesus went to they went to Rio Secreto and some of those other places, and they purchased the biodegradable sunscreen that those places were selling that they said was okay to use, and even that was toxic to the coral reefs.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, so it really, So we won't wear anything before we go out. And one year we took a group of students down and I said, okay, we're going to go to the cenotes. Do not put any lotion, no deodorant, no, and the students just kind of were like panicking because, every day they lotion up, and it was like, what do you mean I'm not going to be able to put on even my regular lotion? No deodorant, nothing, no Axe bodies, nothing on your body. And it was this like, what do you mean I don't use product?
You have to be human. Oh my
Right,
gosh.
yeah, no, nothing in your hair, nothing, and it just that it was that panic.
I mean, the best strategy, obviously, which no one likes to hear, is to just like cover up. Like you can get the swimsuit covers that cover your arms and your back, so you don't have to get skin cancer.
And that's what I've done. I bought the swimsuits that come all the way down to here, cover my whole legs, and it's the, it's a whole one-piece swimsuit. So I don't have to put anything. Yeah, and there's a lot of them online, so you can get swimsuits that cover your whole body.
Yeah, or you can just bring a shirt to cover
t-shirts.
your regular swimsuit when you're snorkeling. So
Yeah, but even we might smell, but we're all together smelling bad.
Love each other, though. All right.
Okay, thank
Just
you.
another quick question.
Yeah, sure, of course.
So those gardens that you started right there, do you ever see anybody take the initiative of doing like vertical gardening systems? Like, I know you did, but like
Oh, here in the
vertical
States, you
farming
mean, or
over there, vertical farming?
In the
in Kenya? Yeah, actually. So that was in a slum where they have no resources, right? And so beyond like vertical farming in these burlap sacks, which is what they were doing, they obviously don't have the technical infrastructure to do that. But there are groups there that are starting, vertical farming in indoor buildings. In places like that, though, like honestly, why would you? They have really good climate control year round. But there's really cool vertical farming projects, throughout the upper Midwest even, where we're starting to see that. And Kevin Martin, who's on faculty here at NIU in the engineering
engineering technology.
Has been doing research on lighting systems for hydroponic indoor vertical farming systems. What I would say is even in spaces like Illinois, unless you're in like downtown Chicago, we have good soil and we have sunlight. Like it's just more efficient to grow outside. But there are parts of the world where it makes sense to try and shift our food systems more towards urban centers, because then you eliminate the transportation and carbon emissions. You can sort of empower people to grow food more locally. And so vertical farming in the technical sense starts to make sense. But there's lots of examples around the world of sort of the hodgepodge vertical farming approach happening.
Yeah, one of the things Kevin is doing is working with some abandoned or, like the old Kmarts that are left over, and are these big buildings, and converting those into vertical farming. And then what they're doing is he's using lighting, and he's actually can show that he can improve or change the flavors of different herbs.
Yep.
So like basil is the one they're using right now, but by changing the lighting and the types of lighting that they're using, they can make it more flavorful. They can change the flavor profiles on these things. And he's also working with a group down at UIUC to look at specialty herbs that people need for different types of food growing. Like they want a specialty herb that costs a lot to import it from these other countries, and growing it there and making a lot of money off of specialty herbs.
And herbs have a big return on investment, right? Like if you tried to buy fresh herbs at the grocery market, they're crazy expensive. So they make sense. The other thing I would say about vertical farming is it's often hydroponically done, so you're growing in water, and it is just hard to simulate the macronutrient, micronutrient balance that you would see in soil. And so we have demonstrated, even growing in soil over the last several decades, that as we have depleted our soil, the micronutrient content of our food is going down, and so people are becoming more and more and more micronutrient deficient over time, and that just gets exacerbated if we started to rely exclusively on like high calorie crops from vertical farming. So there's a place for all of this. I think urban agriculture is amazing. I literally spent my career studying it, but you need all the different forms of agriculture to kind of keep us well fed and well balanced.
Yeah, and always need water.
You
Always need water. So that's
water.
why I always do water, because everybody needs water. So, okay.
But happy to chat.